Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our spring clergy development and clergy care webinars. We're so glad to have you here today. This is actually our final one for the spring, and I think we're ending on an extremely high note. We are joined today by Dr. Rob Dixon. He's been with us before, and he did such a great job. We wanted to bring him back again. So, Rob, thank you for joining us today. We're really glad to have you, but I know some people don't know who you are. So as we bring you on and welcome you to the webinar, I would love to start by just giving you a chance to introduce yourself to our guests.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Carla. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone for joining the Facebook call or listening, whatever you're doing. So partnering with the Wesleyan Church, and we'll talk later on in the webinar about some ways we'll do that in the fall. But glad to be here. Just a couple things about me. So I'm Zooming from Central California, where it's going to be 93 degrees today. Now you know how to pray for us here. I live here with my wife, Amy, and our 4 kids. I work in full-time ministry, and it's almost 30 years, which is head scratcher for me to even say that out loud. 30 years of ministry. I work with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is college ministry. Folks on the call may have an InterVarsity background from the time in college, or maybe they know InterVarsity from our publishing house, InterVarsity Press, or perhaps from Urbana, which is the student conference we run every 3 years. But yeah, a long time with InterVarsity. And over those years, and there's a whole backstory to this, Carla, which maybe you can ask me about if you want or some other time. But over the years, I developed this interest in or concern with the dynamics of women and men working together. Are we doing that well? Could we do it better? Why aren't we talking about the dynamics? No one's training on this. And so I sat with all of that. And over time, I don't know how the Lord works for everybody on this call, but for me, when I get bugged by something, often the Lord says, well, how about you do something about that? And so I found myself in a 4-year doctoral program trying to understand the building blocks of healthy partnerships in the ministry workplace between women and men. And nowadays, it's my privilege, joy, honor to do training and coaching and consulting on that topic wherever I can. So it has me on airplanes and on Zoom calls and doing things like this. So it's a joy to do that. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Oh, yes, and that's actually how I discovered you, if you will. I was looking for some material and stumbled across some of the stuff you've done and was blessed to read your material, see what God has been up to in your ministry. And I'll tell you on a personal note, it encouraged me. I'm working on my doctorate right now, and to see how God can take research and use it for the future, that's an encouragement. So thank you. Thank you for
Yeah,
bringing your passion to our call today.
yeah, of course. Of course, yeah.
So our webinar is called Creating a Culture Where Women Can Thrive. And as we start today, that word thrive, lots of people throwing it around. I'm curious how you would define women thriving.
Yeah.
What's the goal of women thriving?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I hear a lot of stories as I make the rounds. I do my consulting or coaching work, training work. Lots of stories of women not thriving, and I'll talk about some of those. I'll share some of those as we go through the webinar. But I thought I would start with a story of a woman who is thriving as a way to kind of paint the picture of what that can look like. So it's a story about a woman named Becca, who's on the pastoral staff of a church not too far from me, a little ways north. And she's doing great. She's thriving. And so a couple of things about that. Number one, she has the full backing of her lead pastor and the other folks kind of on her team. Her lead pastor is a man. He developed her, appointed her into the role. He's like her biggest she will say, biggest cheerleader, like a coach for her, developer. She told me a story one time about how she was preaching and she got some pushback because she's a woman preaching from people in the congregation. And her lead pastor says, I got this. Let me talk to them, right? And it was just, if she were here, she would say, he's got my back. That's thriving, right? Another one, she's operating squarely in her gifting. That's thriving. She is doing what she was made to do, basically, right? And the church, actually, she came up through the ranks. They developed her, they invested in her, they got to know her, and they discerned what she could contribute to the kingdom. And they figured out a way to maximize that, right? And so she is, I use this term sometimes, she's using her superpowers, basically, right? She's doing what she's made to do, what she's good at. And so not only is she thriving, I'd argue that the congregation is thriving as well as she's operating out of her strengths and out of her gifts and out of her passions. Two more. One, she's getting developed. So the church has said, we're behind you. We want to develop you to become even more effective in your ministry. So tangibly, what they've done is they've invested in her education. So she's a master's student, and they are funding a part of that. And probably more than that, they've created space in her job description to do that master's level work as a way to invest in her. That's thriving. And then one more, Becca has kids, and the church has taken seriously her life stage. And so she told me a story or two about they've had conversations with the pastoral staff and the lead pastor, the elder team about, what boundaries does she need to have in her life? What system can they create so that she can be a mom and a pastor? She told a story one time about how her babysitting fell through and she had to bring the kids into the church for a meeting she had, and the church staff loved having the kids there. The kids loved being there. No one got any work done, but that was okay, right? It was that whole picture. So anyway, that's a little bit, there's probably more to say, but that's a little bit of a snapshot of what thriving can look like as we think about women serving in our churches.
I love that. And we have, I believe, I'm looking at 2024 numbers maybe, but we have more men than women in our denomination. We're egalitarian. We believe in women and men serving together, but we do have more men serving together. So some of the things you just described really fit well with where we are as a Wesleyan church, with maybe a male lead pastor supporting somebody who's called into ministry and developing them. So as we're talking about that, just love hearing that story. And I know you have more things to share. I think we've talked about, you have 5 particular things
Yeah.
that Wesleyan pastors, our denomination, can do to help women thrive. And
Yeah.
I know it's not just for men and women listening in, but what is the first thing on your list of 5 particular things Wesleyans can do?
Well, I picked 5. That felt like a good number for a webinar of an hour, but I could probably talk a lot longer. There's a lot of things I think that churches can really think about here. And the 5 things I'll share are all things that I've seen either churches doing well or churches doing poorly. And so that's informed by kind of my experience with folks. The first one I'll say is pastors, it's beneficial to make space to hear the stories of women in your congregation. And by making space to hear the stories of women, I mean like the unfiltered, as much as you can, the honest, the true, the vulnerable stories of women in the congregation. I think sometimes pastors, we assume we know what's happening in the congregation, but there's really no substitute for hearing those stories directly and understanding really what's happening for, in this case, for women in the congregation. I was doing some consulting work with a different denomination last year, and they wanted to become a denomination that empowers women. They stumbled across me too, and they reached out, and we met up, and I said, well, what are the issues? What are the problems that women face in your denomination? And they gave me a list. This leadership team, mostly men, gave me a list of that. And I said, okay, would it be okay if I survey some women in the denomination just to fill out the picture a bit? And so I did that. I conducted a survey, gathered all this data, sifted the data. And in the end, there was some overlap between what they said and what was on the survey data, but there was a lot that I learned afresh from the survey process. And that just underscored for me this point that I think sometimes as leaders, we think we know what's happening kind of on the grassroots level, or in this case, what the experience of women is in the congregation, but better to get good data, better to get data that's as unfiltered as you can get. So maybe Carla, I'll offer just a couple of thoughts of how pastors might go about doing that, if that's all right. So
Yeah, absolutely.
one, I think as you're going to sit down as a pastor with a woman in your congregation to hear about their experience, you want to make sure you're in a good headspace and a good heart space to listen well, to receive without being defensive. You may hear things that are hard to hear, that are even personally hard to hear. And so I think the first thing I'd encourage folks to do is to really get in the right headspace. Second, I think as you invite a woman to give you their input, you want to make sure you're clear about what that is and say, hey, here's my point of meeting here. I'm not fixing things. I just want to listen. I want to learn, right, to set the right sort of expectation for the meeting. I think sometimes I've seen this with pastors that want to hear from women in the denomination. They read, or the congregation, they reach out to ask for a meeting, and the answer is, well, no, or not now, or can you talk to me in a few months? And I think you might need to be prepared for that. Pastors might need to be prepared for that, because sometimes, especially for women who have experienced some sort of pain or marginalization, there just needs to be time kind of to work themselves up to be in a meeting like that. A couple more. When you're having this conversation, listen well. I think pastors, you want to be on your A game, listening and nonverbal communication, right? Paraphrasing for understand, all the things that hopefully we know how to do as pastors. You want to listen well. You want to ask thoughtful questions. Hey, tell me more about that. I think one of the things I've learned the hard way, my own leadership working with women, is sometimes I've realized I'm asking a question that feels maybe a little bit intrusive. And so I've learned to ask the prior question, which is, hey, would it be okay if I ask you about blank? And then, yes, okay, great. Then I'll ask the question, right? So ask for permission before asking the question. Maybe one more thing. I think as pastors listen, as they get good data, as they learn, make sure you respond well to that, right? Someone's given you a gift of telling you about their experience in the congregation, and you want to make sure you hold that information kind of well, and then you want to act on that at the appropriate time. So those are a few thoughts anyway, but I think the heading here is for pastors to get good data, to listen to the stories of women in their congregation and not assume they know what women are experiencing. So that's my first one.
That's so good, so good. I think we could apply that to really almost
Yeah.
anything, any topic. Quick question on that. If you're gonna invest the time to get to know the stories of women in your congregation, and you're trying to set up some time to talk, is it good to give them some, hey, I'm gonna ask these questions so they can think about it ahead of time, or is that not helpful because it needs to be more, on the spot?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it can vary by person. I'm wired. If you ask me to talk about something that might be tender or even a little bit painful for me, I'm really helped with lead time. And
Yeah.
tell me what this conversation is gonna be like. Let me reflect on the questions ahead of time if possible, right? I'm an introvert and I'm an internal processor, so give me all that. But I think for some people to sort of lead and say, well, here's what I want to talk about actually creates anxiety than to have to wait for multiple days or whatever it is to like have the conversation. So maybe I'd say be discerning about the folks that you're meeting with, and maybe even ask them, hey, I can give you the questions ahead of time and you can reflect, or we could just go live. What do you think? What's helpful for you? That might be the way to go.
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, that was number one.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the number two?
Okay, number two, I think for pastors on the call, make sure you're investing in women in your congregation, right? So that's part of the success from Becca's story I just mentioned, right? She had multiple people actually, who were investing in her over time and developing her. And so at some point she was ready to take that step into pastoral leadership, but that didn't come overnight. That was a kind of an evolution in her life. I think for a lot of pastors, I see this a lot. You have a choice in who you invest in, and the question is, are you investing in women alongside men? Especially for male pastors, I think that's a relevant question. But for every kind of pastor, right? Are you investing in a diverse collection of people in the congregation? I'll tell a story. So I was doing some consulting with a small organization, and they were lamenting that they don't have women at the senior levels of the organization. Like, we can't ever get women to stay long enough to serve at this level. And I was like, well, I mean, why? Let's talk about kind of what's working, what's not working to get women into that place. And one of the things they realized as we talked was that the process, the hiring process, the whole kind of all the way from like candidate to application to that whole thing was scary for the women in their organization. Right? Women didn't understand it. It was mysterious. It felt foreign. And so we set about trying to demystify that process, right? And that was a whole thing, like looking at who's the candidate pool, is it diverse, and really asking tough questions of ourselves about how we evaluate who's in that pool. And then the thing I liked the most about what they did was they created a mentorship program. So as women entered into the pipeline, prepared for the interview, filled out the application, the whole thing, there was a senior woman who had walked that road previously who could mentor, advise, coach. Hey, this application answer could be a bit better. Let me ask you questions that you might get asked in the interview, those kinds of things. that then paved the way for there to be more women at the level to be considered for those higher profile, jobs in the organization. And so there was this investment in the pipeline with an eye towards developing more women, so that at the critical moment you have choices to make that involve not just men but women as well. And so the question I think I would ask everyone on the call is, what's your leadership development pipeline look like? Is it accessible for women who might see themselves as wanting to do that but aren't sure? Maybe they're a little nervous about the process, and for good reason. And then the second question would be like, are people on this call, as you're thinking about this, are you developing intentionally people of both genders, men and women, to be a part of your pipeline? If you're looking for something super practical to do in response to this webinar, and I hope people are, it might be worth taking 30 to 45 minutes and just sitting down and thinking, who's in leadership in this church, in my church, and does it reflect our value for women and men working together? And just take a kind of cold, unflinching kind of assessment of that and look for gaps. Oh, wow, we aren't doing well with women in this area, or we are doing well over here. And then understanding why we're not doing well, why we are doing well over here. And so it's having that sort of diagnostic kind of process would be, I think, a really valuable step for folks on the call.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't, as a female, you don't want to be the token female
Yeah.
asked to do something just because you're female, but sometimes there's studies out that show women are less likely to try something new if they don't feel they're overqualified and maybe other things. So leadership development is maybe helping a female see that in themselves a little bit more. Lots of different research out there. So it's not a question. I just want to remind all those listening, if you do have a question, if Rob says something and that sparks a thought, make sure you're letting us know, throw it into the comments. We aren't going to try and trip him up, but he is here to answer your questions. So if anything comes to mind, throw it in there, and would love to talk about all of this, because this is really helpful as we're talking about men and women serving together, because that's what we believe in. But as you said, we got to get practical. We got to get down to the nitty gritty and how we make this happen.
Yep.
Okay, so we're 1 and 2.
Okay.
What's
Yep. One more quick coda on that second one, actually, based on what you said, Carla. I have a friend who does training for women as kind of part of her ministry, and she always talks about negotiating the no. So she'll say that when women get asked to do something that feels like a stretch assignment, the first answer often is no, not always, but often is no. And so her thing is, how do we say, okay, can you tell me why, and sort of negotiate that no, and then hopefully later on down the line, they're in a place to say yes. So, right, so not to put pressure on women, but that idea of like negotiating the no. There's data out there, like you said, there's research that suggests that like women are going to take more time to get to the place where they say yes. They don't self-select as often as maybe underqualified men self-select. So there's data on that, but negotiating the no would be another thought.
I just want to say thank you for sharing that. That's so good, so helpful. And coupling that with, if you can find people that have been there before, if you can find a female to serve as a mentor, that helps give clarity, vision to what it can look like. I mean, there are some times where you have to be the first female that's ever done that in your church.
Yep.
But to find somebody that you can follow in their footsteps, and not that you have to be like them, but to know that it is possible, and plant the seed of a possibility in the mind of a female.
Yeah, be great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Third one for me, third suggestion for you as you think about creating a culture where women can thrive, is to embrace what's a biblical paradigm for how we relate as women and men in the community, kingdom community, and that's the idea of being sacred siblings or brothers and sisters in Christ. So can we think about adopting a biblical paradigm and making it normative in our churches? I think if we can do that and have that actually mean something practically in our day-to-day interactions, I think we'll be on our way towards women thriving. Mark 3 would be one place where Jesus talks about this idea of brothers and sisters. You might remember the passage. I'm speaking to pastors. You all know the passage, but the one where he says, right, those who do the will of God are my brother and sister, and then on from there, right? But this idea that we are family with one another. Now, the metaphor isn't perfect. I'm aware as I say it that, there are people on the call probably that don't have siblings. And so you don't have that sort of frame of reference. Also, too often, tragically, there are people that have sibling relationships that are like unsafe
Mm.
or
Yeah.
challenging or problematic in some way, negative in some way. And so there are definitely limitations to the metaphor. But I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been doing some writing on this, about the paradigm has a lot, I think, to offer the church. This paradigm of sacred siblings has a lot to offer the church and women in particular in the church. So, a couple things. First, I think it does place this emphasis on the fact that we are family. We are bonded together. I mean, in the best version of family, right? That we are connected, that we don't break apart easily. So when conflict happens, like we work it out, we're committed to that. I think of families, the best case again is having each other's backs. Like kind of what Becca was saying, right, about her pastor, right? Having this idea that we look out for each other. We want the success of the other person. And if you can really create a culture where that idea of brothers and sisters becomes normative and ubiquitous in the culture, then I think you benefit from this idea that we're bonded in that way. Second, I think this idea of brothers and sisters, it really does sow respect. I'll use that word, sow respect into the culture, right? I think for women who may struggle, like it's just an opportunity to say, like, you are my sister in Christ. That matters to me. That means you're a person of value and worth, right? It just communicates that, I think, in a good way. Siblings want the best for each other most time, hopefully. And so that kind of speaks to that. And then the third benefit to having this paradigm be something that gets kind of woven into the culture is that I think it can take some of the concerns about sexual dynamics off the table. It doesn't fully remove those, I think, but it does change the paradigm if you're seeing each other as a brother and sister in Christ first, right? And it sort of resolves some of that. It doesn't take it all away, and we can talk about that if you want, but it does sort of like diffuse a little bit of that, right? I see you as a sister in Christ first and foremost. That's how I think of you. That's how I treat you, right? How do you get this paradigm kind of woven into the culture of the church? I'll suggest a couple of things. I think for one thing, never a bad idea to preach on this, right?
Yeah.
So you can do a sermon series on the biblical paradigm of brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, you can talk about Mark 3. One of my favorite passages is Psalm 133. How good and beautiful it is when brothers and sisters live together in harmony, I think it is, and it's like oil flowing down the beard of Aaron, right? It's this really beautiful psalm, and you could talk about that, right? Or you could talk about some of the writings that Paul offers. And so maybe a sermon series would be a way to like introduce the paradigm. I think about book groups too. There's a lot of books out there that speak to how do we work together as women and men, and can we see each other as brothers and sisters. So Carla, I'll do a little bit of a book plug if that's okay.
Please do.
All
Yes.
right, so you can read my book. This is not like an infomercial for Rob's book, but it's this one. It's Together in Ministry, and you're welcome to take a look at that. Another one that I really like on this topic is this one. It's got the best title of any book I've seen in a long time.
That's a
Beyond
great
Awkward
title.
Side Hugs, right? The subtitle is Living as Christian Brothers and Sisters in a Sex-Crazed World. This came out from a few years ago from a pastor up in the Sacramento area, and it is fantastic as well. So like a book group and just sort of like in exploring the paradigm together, I think could be really awesome. And then the last suggestion I'll make about kind of weaving this into your church culture is using the language, just committing to say, hi, brother, hi, sister. Now, that may feel super awkward when I say that, even just sort of myself, like it'd be weird to call Carla like, hey, sister, but I think language can drive culture, right? Sometimes. And so when you commit to using that language, you start to see the other person in that way, and you start to change how the culture kind of is managed. And so may feel awkward at first, but I think you get used to it. I know a couple of congregations and a couple of organizations I've done work with are really focusing on this, and they're like, we've got some totally like stories that were really awkward, but like at some point it becomes normative and it's really beneficial for folks. So that'd be another one, is thinking through the brother and sister paradigm. It's my third one.
I love that one. There's so many one-liners in there that I'm holding on to and going to listen to this webinar again and
Yeah.
again. I have a quick question going back to
Yeah.
number 2 from somebody listening
Yeah.
in. You were talking about mentoring. Just a simple question. Do you recommend a good process for finding a female mentor?
Yeah, great question. It's a great question. It kind of depends on the context a little bit and what's kind of available, but I think generally speaking, when I'm looking for a mentor in my life, I'm asking myself first the question like, what do I need? What am I looking for? And so having some clarity about that. It may be that you're looking for a general mentor, like mentor me in all the things, and that's fine. But oftentimes, what I'll find in my own life is I need mentoring in a certain, let's say, ministry skill area, or like there's something I'm struggling with, and I could use mentoring in that area. And so having clarity about the thing that you are looking for help with, I think is important. And then beyond that, I just think what's available, and this may feel overly simplistic, Carla, but I think sometimes you just gotta like muscle up and ask. Muscle
Yeah,
up's language. I use that with my kids sometimes. Like you just have to like push through your
yeah,
discomfort and ask someone if they would walk with you for a season,
yeah,
right? And say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Could you come alongside and help me?
yeah,
The other option is there may be like a like an older leader that you respect that has a network
yeah.
that they could then maybe sort of bring two people together, and in terms of a mentoring partnership, that may be the other option. But I do think, look, I really need help here. I have conviction that I need help here. I see you and what you do. Could we meet from time to time? Yeah,
I definitely think you have to be your best advocate. If you're looking for a mentor, you have to be your best advocate to
that's right.
find one and push and ask. And if anyone's listening and they're like, I don't really know where to look, um, we are an organization that has district leaders, and you could always reach out to me and we can try and help you, but you have to be the one pushing and asking for that. So great. Thank you for Rob for
Sure.
that advice. Okay, I think we're on number four. Is that
Four. Let's
okay?
do it. Yeah. My fourth thought is being really intentional. Pastors being really intentional to amplify the voices of women.
Mm, yeah,
And it's going to take intentionality, I think, sometimes. I mean, pastors have choices in what they talk about, either from the mic up front on a Sunday morning, or they have choices in terms of what they put in the church newsletter. They have choices in what they put on social media, wherever else, Sunday school, whatever else, wherever it is, you have platform.
right.
You have choices in what you talk about. And maybe I'll just say a couple of specific questions here, Carla. So one would be, what stories are we telling in our sermons? What Bible characters are we choosing to profile? What sort of heroes or heroines from church history are we talking about, right? And the question would be like, do your stories and your illustrations, are they only about men, or are they about women as well? And I think trying to diversify that is worthy work. It's helpful work, and it will help women thrive in the congregation. A couple other questions. What about quotations? So when you quote a theologian or a commentator in your sermon, is that always men, or are you seeking a diverse collection of voices for that, right? I mean, to be sure, there's a gap, I'd say, in terms of what's been published for over the years, in terms of women finding their way into commentaries, but they are out there. And so I just would encourage pastors, do that work, roll up your sleeves, hunt around, find voices that can inform your sermon and disciple your congregation from different kind of areas, right? And then the other question would be, what are you doing on social media? What are you posting? Like, what's out there? I think about once a month or so, maybe every 6 weeks, I try to sit down and I go back through my social media feeds and I just do a little bit of an interrogation, like who am I platforming? Who am I amplifying? And in particular with this topic, am I sharing equally the voices of women and men, right? Generally speaking, because I'm doing what I'm doing and how my life is oriented right now, my ministry is oriented, I'm sharing more women than men. So sometimes I actually have to kind of work that angle. But I think it's worth just pausing and saying, okay, who have I retweeted lately? Who am I reposting? And paying attention to that. A quick story, a couple of years back, InterVarsity's president was giving a talk to the entire organization. That's a big spot, right? You're investing in the whole group, 2,000 people or so, whatever it is. And I decided as he was talking that I would track his stories, right? I would just like, okay, is he telling stories of men and women? I mean, he gave a litany of stories about like people doing great things on campus and our ministry. Fantastic. And I'm listening, and he just absolutely nailed it, Carla. He told, I don't know if it was 50-50, but it was close, right? I was like, wow, he really nailed that. And so I emailed him afterward, and I said, look, Tom, you did a great job. Like, I noticed this. I just was so impressed. And he wrote me back, and he said, I'm so glad you noticed. I worked really hard at that, right? And I was like, okay, that's what it takes, right? That commitment to diversifying your story list so that it becomes a place where you can amplify the stories of women. So I think a little intentionality goes a long way here, right? It's worth the effort. Why? Because I think number one, when you tell stories of women from the pulpit, you give the women in your congregation the chance to feel seen. That's the first thing, right? They feel seen. Secondly, you give them an example to emulate that they can connect with, right? That they can see themselves in. And so if you want women to thrive in your congregation, amplify their voices. That'd be my fourth one.
Can you speak a little bit? Well, first, I should probably comments that we've had, not questions. We had somebody again on the mentoring, just suggesting a list of women in our denomination willing to mentor. So thank you for that
Good
comment.
idea.
And then one person saying their church is getting ready to start a Bible study about the lesser known biblical heroes and heroines. So love that. Um, and just like how sometimes we don't share as many stories about women in the Bible
Yeah.
in our Bible story or Bible studies or small groups, and so some comments. But I have kind of maybe a little side question
Yeah.
slash observation. I think sometimes when we do share stories of women, um, they fit into specific categories. Like we only talk about women as mothers, or we only talk about women doing like womanly, feminine things. And obviously, we're a denomination that we believe in, gender, male and female, and all of that. But not every woman is a mom,
Right.
and right, not every woman fits into this neat little box. So, just I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit of like that intentionality of making sure you're not just diversifying this, that you're talking about women and men, but you're talking about like lots of different types of stories.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. That's a great point, right? So, the Proverbs 31 woman we talk about on Mother's Day or whatever, that's great. But like last week, I did a talk with college students over not too far from where I live, and I did Judges 4. That's the Deborah story, but it's also the JL story, right? And if you remember at the end of that passage, what does JL do? Yeah, I was like, so let's just talk about what biblical womanhood is.
Yes.
And we opened up that conversation, and I said, please don't take violence. The point of the passage is not to be violent, but the point of the passage is to say, at least part of the point of the passage is to say that womanhood gets expressed differently,
Yeah.
and there's freedom for that. And so I think about, you could preach Judges 4, you could preach Romans 16, where there are women who are
Yes.
doing amazing things. I think of Junia in Romans 16:7, who's an apostle, outstanding, prominent among the apostles. And it's worth talking about those stories because it does give a multifaceted view, and I think the converse is also true, actually, Carla, right? Like a lot of guys, I think, are wired probably to be like the stereotype suggests, like we're going to go take the hill and assertive and strong, but a lot of guys are also not that way, and so I think telling the full story of examples in the Bible of masculinity alongside femininity is important. So, yeah. So try to diversify that as you do your teaching.
We have one more question on this
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
What does it look like to work towards women thriving when you enter into a context where you are not the primary leader, or you are in a context only temporarily, like
Yeah.
going to conferences, interacting with leaders from other denominations, etc.?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. Great question. I think my answer to that would be it can depend on the context for sure. But I think sometimes we think of change as top down only, right? And certainly change happening from the top down is great. So when the leadership in the Wesleyan denomination says we're going to do this, that means a lot, and everybody in the denomination has to rally around that, right? Same with InterVarsity. When InterVarsity president says X, Y, and Z, those of us on the lower levels of the organization are like, okay, we know what we're doing. So change from the top down is awesome, but there's also change from the bottom up, or maybe even change from the middle. And I think about, so for someone who would ask that question, the question I think I would respond with is, where do you have access? Where do you have capacity or agency to bring change? And oftentimes that's in a program in a church, or maybe it's like on an initiative in the denomination or a task force where there's some degree of power and influence and some change can happen, not from the top down. And so I'll say sometimes, like, go for it, like figure out a different way to do whatever it is you're doing in a way that reflects God's heart for women and men working together. Give it a shot. And then as you see fruit, which I trust you will, then your job becomes amplifying that or broadcasting what's happening at the lower level or the middle level to the upper level, and then maybe change kind of meets in the middle. Does that make sense, Carla? Am I being too conceptual?
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
really helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So, like for example, I'll give a concrete. So, if you're trying to, like, if you're a leader in the kids ministry, let's say, and you start telling stories about Junia, and I don't know if you want to tell JL's story to a bunch of whatever 5-year-olds, but maybe you're talking about Deborah, and you're telling these stories, and it's not the standard curriculum. You have power. You have access in that space. You've been commissioned to do that work, and so I think that's my encouragement to do that. And then as you see kids respond to those stories, oh, I didn't know a girl could do this, that, or whatever, then you share that up the line and people go, okay, maybe we should be thinking more holistically about this, right? So maybe it's a small example.
Love it, but I love it. Thank you for
Yeah,
answering that.
yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna let you go to your fifth one
Okay,
so that I don't
okay.
lose your track. I think we're on
Yeah.
number.
The fifth one is let women lead.
Yeah.
That's my fifth piece of advice. So women will thrive when they are freed up to use their gifts and express their callings, whatever God's put into them, right? So like the pastor with Becca, like women will thrive when they are commissioned, blessed, anointed, sent forth to exercise leadership in places where God's put them, right? So put them to work, just like you do men in your congregation. So let me give a caution here, and I've seen this happen too often, a caution here. I think particularly if the ministry assignment is, let's say, a new one for women, it's outside of their kind of set of experiences, or maybe it's like a stretch assignment. I think I mentioned a stretch assignment earlier. It's like just something that feels like a bit of a challenge, stretch, a reach. My encouragement to pastors would be to make sure you're giving those women the support they need in order to make the assignment work, right? Your full support. A friend of mine who wrote actually a great book called Glass Walls, totally recommend. I don't have it to hold up, but anyway, a great book called Glass Walls. She uses the term glass cliff to describe the reality that women sometimes get put in positions with a high risk of failure, right? That they'll literally fall off the cliff, right? And I always think that's a helpful image to think about. And so if that's true, if there is a little bit of a cliff, it's a hard assignment, or if it's a stretch assignment, again, pastors, please watch out for those cliffs. Please set up some guardrails so that the women won't fall off those cliffs. You want the experience to be a positive, developmental, life-giving one. And if the cliff is just going to be there no matter what, here's a couple of questions to think about. First of all, what will the woman in that position need from you as a pastor in terms of prep support? So on the front end, as they think about preparing for whatever the ministry thing is, you might need to micromanage the process just a bit. You might need to be more involved than you would ordinarily, especially if a woman's exercising leadership for the first time. So pay attention to that. You might need to dedicate more of your time than you even feel comfortable with toward making the prep work so that the mission becomes a success. Second thing I'd encourage folks to do is, as you put women in those situations, be there if at all possible. Be present if at all possible, right? I think your presence in that environment sends a message that you're with her, you're supporting her, you're blessing this whole endeavor, right? You're invested in it. The contrast is also true. Your lack of presence also sends a message, and it may not be the message you want to send, right? So at all possible, I know there's times where you can't, but you want to be present to that. And then the third thing to say is be thoughtful about a debrief, right? Make it a developmental opportunity and say, okay, you've just finished this thing, you got through it. let's meet up and do a really thorough debrief and understand what God was doing and how it's working for you and how it could be different next time, and give really good feedback to that. And so maybe what I'm saying is, for pastors that are putting women in those situations, up your game
Yeah.
in terms of your supervision and your care and your support for those women. You want it to be a positive experience. Maybe I'll tell one more quick story before I turn it back to you, Kyle. So there was a church in town, not far from here, where I live, that the pastor wanted to have this woman preach for the first time in the church's history. First time a woman would preach in the church's history. It was a big deal. And he did the work of prepping. They did a good job of that. And then on the day, I was really struck by this. He got up before the woman was set to start preaching and basically said, look, this is what we're doing, why we're doing it. This is important to me. And then he said, if you have concerns about Denise preaching, you can talk to me. Personally, I can't wait to hear what God has to say through our sister. And it just struck me like he went out of his way to make that experience that had a big cliff behind it,
Yeah.
to make that experience as positive as possible for Denise. And it was a beautiful kind of experience for her. So I'll stop there, but let her lead, but then do a good job making that a positive experience.
Yes. Well, and just to that story, so a woman in our denomination recently completed her doctorate studying females preaching. And one of the themes that came up as she shared her research findings was women sometimes represent women as a whole, right? So if they get up and they preach and they don't do a good job, somebody will
Yeah.
say, "Oh, I heard a female preach once, and they didn't do a good job." So
Yep.
you're not just prepping and developing for that individual, you're also helping your congregation receive it better. You're helping you're helping
Yep.
others be able to embrace that female in leadership as well.
Yep.
So it's just more helpful
Yeah.
all around.
Yeah. That I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a pressure that men don't face.
Yes.
Right, this idea that if I get up and preach in a pulpit, I'm speaking for all men of all times. That's not what I experience, but it is what women do experience. And so I think part of the thing for a pastor in that scenario might be to take some pressure off, right? Like, we're committed to this value. We're going to do this again and again. I'm happy to have this person today speaking, right? And just try to, like, maybe take some of that, like a release valve, kind of to remove some of that pressure, because I think it's a really significant thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And some of the first times I was preaching, um, I remember how much I valued the fact that my senior pastor was still in the room. It wasn't the only time I preached wasn't just when he was on vacation, which
Yeah.
should happen, right? If you go on vacation, you do have somebody else preaching,
Yep.
but he was intentional about giving me the opportunity to preach when he was also going to be in the room, and then we could talk about it later.
Yeah, I
Um,
saw you nod. I saw you nod when I said that. I was like, oh, she's got a story there. Yeah.
that meant a lot to me as a developing leader.
Yeah.
We have a question here. The question is, how would you suggest combating the narrative that focusing on including women is distracting from the gospel message,
Mm.
or that it's too much of a social justice focus and not a top priority?
Yeah. Great question. There might be some pain behind that question if I'm hearing it right. Um, Again, I don't want to sound trite here, but I think time in the scriptures would be my antidote to that. So to say to the congregation, and I think the pastor, the story I told where he had a woman preaching for the first time, he didn't probably do enough of this, but to make space for the church to wrestle with the scriptures on this topic of women in leadership and women and men in partnership. The truth is, as I make the rounds, and this is true even in my own organization, I think a lot of people have a theology of women in ministry, but it's relatively uninformed by personal theological reflection. In other words, they've kind of breathed the air of whatever church they were a part of, or their family of origin, or a book someone read one time, or a story someone told one time, and they haven't actually done the work themselves in the text. And so my encouragement always, and it can feel messy, challenging, I get it, but to try to create a well-curated space for people to roll up their sleeves and get in the scriptures in community under the leadership of the Spirit and let God speak through the scriptures, right? The reality is, I mean, and people will say, well, let's start with 1 Timothy 2. We can talk 1 Timothy 2, but really the whole of the scripture has something to say on this topic, right? And so I'm always trying to let's talk about Genesis 1. move through the Old Testament. Let's look at Jesus. Let's look at the theology and the praxis of the first church. Let's figure out how First Timothy 2 fits into that whole thing. So creating that kind of theological reflection space that's well resourced, well led. I think there's no substitute for that, right? Because then you're making the case that this is not just a PC thing or a social justice thing or, some woke thing, right? This is the Bible and what the Bible has to say about women leading in the church. And so I think that'd be my encouragement, is kind of make that space. It's going to take, I get it, it's hard, it's messy. It's going to take not doing other things in order to do that theological reflection, but I don't think there's a substitute for it. Does that make sense, Carla?
Absolutely. And I think I would add, as a female, sometimes we can talk as if we're victims,
Mm,
and we can be in non-thriving environments, but we don't want that to be the focus. The focus is being people that are truly living out the image of God in our lives and living out how God has designed us to be. So I think my advice to the person asking the question is, you don't want to make it all about what wrong has been done. Let's celebrate what God has called men and women to do and how he's called us to serve together. So there are times and places, and just like your first point, Rob, we need to listen to the stories of women and we need to be willing to listen. But there are times when um, we can let, um, well, I don't know how to say that without making it sound just, we can take the hurt that we have and make the hurt the focus,
right.
instead of how God has designed us in his image to
Yeah.
be bearers of the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Mhm.
Okay, another question.
Mhm.
Okay. This is a longer one. Okay, I think there's a significant gap of representation of young women leading, often because of their role as mothers and
Okay.
taking time to focus on family. How can we bridge that gap, knowing that motherhood is a significant reality for many women in ministry? How does that support look different than the support offered to young men in ministry, who will often have more availability in their early days of ministry
Yeah.
paired with parenthood?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. It's a lot to unravel there, I think. I think for pastors on this call who have some degree of authority in the system, in your church system, the question I would ask you is, like, what's your vision for women during those childbearing years? And is your vision about, like, preserving their calling, even developing their calling, and keeping them as engaged as they can be, so that down the road, once they have more time, they're able to exercise more leadership? I mean, one of the things, again, I'm a middle manager in InterVarsity, but I do have some degree of authority, and so I've just tried really, really hard. If a woman is called to be in ministry and is having babies, and I'm just, whatever I can do to keep you on staff, to keep you engaged, I will do anything to do that, right? So we will work with adjustable schedules. I'll figure out babysitting support. Like, I will just do whatever it takes to keep a woman who wants to be in ministry on staff. Because the truth is, if we don't, we lose that woman. And then our ministry is impoverished for the next 3, 4, 5, even longer years, because she's not there to give the leadership that we want. And so, again, I think if you have that kind of autonomy in your system, do what you can to keep women involved if they want to be. Now, some women don't. I mean, my own wife, Amy, was working with InterVarsity for a long time. And then when we had, I think we have 4 kids like you, Carla, when we had our third, maybe, she was like, I'm out.
Yes.
I'm done. I don't need to do ministry anymore. And it was like this heartbreaking thing for me, but it was the right thing for her. And so at that point, it's like, okay, like, we can call, but if a woman doesn't feel that way, wants to be involved, wants to keep exercising leadership, then I would plead with people to bend over backwards to make it work for her, and then get through that season, and then on from there. Now, for the guys, can I just say this? I think sometimes it's our privilege to not, to, like, be able not have to slow down when we have kids, and maybe we should.
Yeah.
Maybe we should. Right. And we should rethink how we operate during that season, so that we pull back some to give more support in the home, to be a dad. Right. That's a beautiful thing. And I think sometimes we maybe just sort of say, okay, yeah, great, but on with the show, right? Let's go take the hill again. So I think for guys, there's a caution, and maybe more guys need to slow down during that season. Yeah, I'll stop there.
And I would say uh, a mentor, if
Mm.
you can find a female in ministry who had young kids at one time and how did they navigate that? It's going to look different for every situation, every family, number of kids, but if you can find somebody that was navigating that, even if it was 20 years ago, that might be, as we were talking about mentoring, that might be a specific area, and somebody that can reach out. We have just a
Can I say,
call.
Carla, one more thing real quick?
Yeah.
I think moms make great ministers.
Yes.
They just do, right? Because they have a perspective it's different, it's changed from before they were moms, and that is to the benefit of the church. So if you can invest in women during those childbearing years, you're going to benefit from that later on with the perspective they bring.
Absolutely. Thanks for saying that, Rob.
Yeah.
Just a comment, somebody affirming, allowing women to preach when the male pastor is still in the room clearly communicates she is not the B team.
Yeah.
And allowing women to preach when the male pastor is on vacation communicates that she is trusted to rightly divide the scriptures.
Yeah.
So thank you for that comment.
Amen.
Rob, I just want to open the floor to you. You've shared your 5 thoughts.
No?
I could talk with you about this topic for hours.
Yeah.
I think on both of our hearts.
Mhm.
What final thoughts would you like to share with us?
Yeah. Well, a couple things come to mind. So, one, for guys on this call, I'll just encourage you to be an ally. I'm writing a book right now on what it looks like to be, how can the church develop more men into more effective allies to women? And I think sometimes in the conversation around gender equality and like empowering women, men can feel start like left out or what's my role here? It's confusing. I'm here to help. Be an ally, right? Choose to take the posture of an ally. Choose to identify as an ally, and there's lots you can do to make that happen. I think allies. I talk about a range of allyship behaviors sometimes, Carla. So advocacy is one thing, but also standing in solidarity, amplifying, learning is a way to express allyship. So for the guys on the call, I'll encourage you to join me in trying to be the best ally you can be for the women around you. I think for everybody, maybe two thoughts real quick. One is we're trying to change a system that's been entrenched for a long time. It's been in place for a long time. I think as we talk about women and men partnering together more fully, as we talk about all the things we talked about in this webinar, it's going to take some courage to rewrite or to reframe how the church operates around this. So I was at a meeting a while back, and Ruth Haley Barton, if folks know that name, she's a spiritual direction kind of person, spiritual formation. She's been a mentor to me. Fantastic. She got up at this event. It was honoring, I think, 25 years of female ordination in this one denomination. And she said, here's my vision that in 25 years, we won't have to have a meeting like this because the church will have figured out how to operate as women and men. And I was sitting in there going, amen, I'm in. I'll be whatever, 75 at that point, but I'm in. Let's give it a shot. But then the next thought I had, Carla, was like, do I have the faith for that? Like to really believe that the church could change? Because it just feels so overwhelming. So I think maybe I just would encourage people here to have courage, to be brave, to do things differently, to try things out, to work on change at all the levels, right? And then the second thing I'll land with this is to be intentional. All the things we're talking about in this webinar have that intentional theme in common, right? To intentionally listen to the women in your congregation, to intentionally amplify the voices of women, to intentionally, come alongside a woman as she leads and keep her away from the cliff. Like all of that requires intentionality and focus. None of this will just happen. None of it will just happen, right? So my word to everyone listening would be courageous, to be intentional, and for guys, let's be good allies.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna, Rob did not pay me to say this, but Rob is an author, so he does have that Together in Ministry book. Highly recommend, and would encourage you. It's InterVarsity. And then he's got a new book coming out in 2026 about ministry ally. But he and his wife also wrote a book called Penny Preaches.
Yeah.
And it is a awesome children's book, and you should have it. I have it on my shelf. If you have kids, kids ministry, it's a great introduction to the fact that women and men, boys and girls, God calls everybody. So love that. And Rob has a lot of wisdom, and I've asked him to share with us as the Wesleyan Church, and he's shared earlier that he has met with multiple denominations. So we have some exciting news to share with you about the future, the fall. We are going to talk together. We're going to do this cohort together. So, Rob, could you share a little bit about what this Better Together cohort is going to
Yeah.
be all about?
Yeah, well, first I should give credit where credit's due. Better Together is a book by Danielle Strickland that's also worth your time and attention. It's about women and men working together. I'm borrowing the title from that, but it's basically four 90-minute sessions on Zoom over the span of 4 weeks, August into November, to just on Thursdays for 90 minutes to just think about the issues of women and men working together and to dialogue about those things. The goal every session is for people to leave with really practical things to do to better reflect the Wesleyan value for women and men working together. And so it'll be super practical. You'll do stuff in between sessions and then come back and we'll debrief that. How'd it go? What'd you learn? So yeah, just super practical. And a lot of the things that we talked about today, we'll just go into more depth on. And so if you like what you've heard, then I think it'd be a good fit for you. So we'd love to have as many who want to join as possible.
So this is going to be a free cohort to our Wesleyan brothers and sisters. We would love to see 50% men, 50% women in the room. There's information. So the dates are on that card. It starts in October, ends in November. I think it's going to be on, yeah, Thursdays, 1
Yeah, Thursday.
o'clock Eastern. That's 10 o'clock. They're in 10 a.m., not
Yep.
p.m. For
Yep.
you Californians, but we're really excited about this. Please be listening and looking for more information so you can get signed up for this cohort. We're not trying to push Rob's agenda. I really think we're trying to elevate what God intended from the beginning, that men and women created in his image would work together, declare together the message of Christ, the gospel, and work together to further the kingdom. I think that's what he intended. And so this isn't an agenda. This isn't a social justice issue. This is God's agenda for his people. And so we're really excited to promote it and talk about it. So make sure you're paying attention for the cohort information led by Dr. Rob Dixon in the fall. Thank you, Rob, so much for being
Oh,
our guest today. It's always a delight to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to our 90-minute discussions in the fall, and thank you so much for being with us.
yeah. Thanks for having me and blessings to everyone who watched or listened. I appreciate y'all doing that.
Thank you. Well, we want to welcome you to enjoy a summer break. June and July, we will not be having our monthly webinars because it's vacation time. School is out, and so we won't be having our regular webinars, but come back in August for more time where we are focusing on your personal and professional development. But for now, I'm signing off. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
In Acts 1, Jesus promises the coming gift of the Holy Spirit to his followers. But there was a gap between the promise and the presence. The author Luke tells us the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room. They all joined together constantly in prayer. The presence of Jesus broke in as they prayed. The Acts 1:8 promise welcomed in with prayer. Wesleyans believe in the empowering gift of the Holy Spirit lived out in us, making us a transforming presence in the spaces around us. Would you and your church join me and our Wesleyan Church family online this Pentecost Sunday, June 8th, to pray in expectation asking God to empower us with His presence to fulfill His purpose. I look forward to praying with you.